everyone, welcome to another Music Talk Tuesday, and today I thought it would be cool to discuss a topic that I kind of wanted to discuss for a while now, and I think is really relevant to music and as far as the evolution of music is concerned. Um, I think that largely was influenced and started within the 1960s. And as you can see by the title, we're going to be discussing the influence of boy bands in particular. Now, boy bands is more than just the title itself. There's a lot of interesting things that sort of make a boy band, besides the fact that there are all boys in the band. So I'm going to kind of go through with you my thoughts in regards to these bands in particular and sort of how they got themselves sort of started and how they sort of are seen and represented today. Now, some people would like to argue that bands like the Beach Boys and as well as the Beatles are sort of considered the first groundworks when it comes to boy bands. Now, what I mean by that is boy bands, obviously from different eras, are not the same. But they sort of encompassed uh, the standards that sort of came with a boy band. For example, a lot of their songs are about love, like the Beatles and the Beach Boys. They had a very marketable appearance, and you will see this through the Beatles' evolution. Once they started in the early 60s, they were all suits and ties, and then all of a sudden, when the style changed, they changed with the style. Sort of with the Beach Boys with the early 60s vibe, they kept that in as well. So there was a certain amount of marketing that went into trying to get the band to appeal to its demographics. And I think it largely succeeded with that. And as a result, they encompass a lot of the things that we think of when we think of a boy band. The Beatles had a very devoted fan base. The Beach Boys, you could say, similar. They toured constantly. They were out in the open, more so probably the Beatles than the Beach Boys, but they were out and about. They were going and performing. They were in the spotlight, and a lot of people that were a part of the demographics that the Beach Boys and the Beatles in particular were trying to appeal to were largely young girls, in particular teenagers. So and they sort of reflected the sort of hip times of that period. So they did encompass a lot of the elements that we associate with band boys, and I think they were sort of the start to these boy bands being developed. There's also sort of a sense of innocence to bands like the Beatles and the Beach Boys. And you can see this with other boy bands also of the time, like the Jackson 5. Uh, and There were others that sort of took the stage for a while, like the Osmonds and the Monkees. But they all seemed to have this very... it's not to say that it is... I don't want to say generic because that's not the right word, but they had this kind of overcoat appeal to people because they approached music with a certain level of standard in that they didn't try to talk down to the audience. They tried to appeal to the audience, and they tried to appeal to their likes and interests. And that's largely what a lot of the 60s boy bands did at the time. They tried to have a certain sense of innocence to them. They tried to be on sort of a level of marketability in regards to the time period, especially when you see the Jackson 5s with their outlandish outfits at points. They tried to appeal to the decade that they were in. And it worked, I think, significantly well. And it transcended to those demographics that that in particular the boy bands of the 60s were trying to appeal to. largely being teenage girls. And trust me, if you see the Beatles, fans, how they were in the 60s, yeah, they were almost approaching kind of One Direction, Justin Bieber territory, and how fan crazed people were back then. So I think there's this underlying assumption that there wasn't like, oh, it was all like, yeah, just everybody go see the Beatles, but there were a lot of people that really were devoted fans to these to these bands. So there was this really high knee-jerk reaction to their names. People got excited. People got a little crazy, and I try to say little, but there was a lot of really crazy videos that you can watch and look up on YouTube and see how um, overblown these fans were at the time. So, yeah, I think that's all I can say about that decade. But it was the decade that did start this trend of incorporating boy bands and incorporating that label. Now, some people don't like to put the Beatles or the Jackson 5 or those that are really well known and well recognized bands that are considered sort of classics into a boy band category. But I think those elements were there. And again, we're only at the beginning stages of the involvement that ended up occurring. So I don't really see how placing them in the boy band category is automatically a bad thing. They did their job and they did it well, so you kind of got to give them credit, uh, especially if they're an all boys band. um, Now, as we approach the 70s and the 80s, there was a lot of, I think, more of the kind of uh, maybe sort of bad boy craze in that there wasn't a lot of, again, it didn't have that sort of innocent approach that it had within the 60s, a lot of bands. But there were some that sort of tried to capture that sort of, marketability of boy bands during these 2 decades. These included Menudo, New Edition, and New Kids on the Block. So there were those that were sort of trying to capture, I think, that kind of level of innocence and sort of marketability that the 60s had. Um, but I don't think it gravitated as well, and I don't even really recognize any of these bands except maybe New Kids on the Block. So during this time, the boy band craze was kind of being replaced by um, really hard rock and roll, where there weren't really I mean, there were love songs, obviously ballads, things like that, but they didn't approach the same kind of, I guess, marketability and the same kind of approach that we saw in the 60s. It was a lot about being cool and edgy, um, more so than about being kind of just hip and fun. So that's kind of the difference that I saw between the 60s and the 70s and between the 70s and 80s. The 70s and 80s were a little bit more on edge, and the 60s were just very peaceful, very, you know, don't upset the established order, and then once the 70s hit and 80s hit, it's all over the place. So it's really hard to say what classifies really as a boy band during that time. But I think a lot of people, especially people who got really invested into 70s and 80s material when it comes to music, they usually those bands that had all men in them usually were, like, um, the Guns N' Roses or Journey. They had a little bit more of an edge to them. Um, and again, there were some songs that did focus on love. Um, but again, it didn't approach that sort of traditional um, boy band that we saw in the 60s. So it was a strange time period. It's almost even hard to really classify anything as a boy band within that period. But I think there were some that again were trying to sort of recapture it, but it didn't really, I think, work out all too well. And the the new boy bands were sort of, the rock hard, party hard, rock and roll stars. That was the 70s and 80s. Um, uh, Now, after the 80s, we get the 90s, which I think a lot of people like to consider as the decade of the boy bands because there were so many of them, including Boys to Men, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC, 98 Degrees, Westlife. Um, there was just a ton of them out there, and they were there in the forefront and at the center of attention. So there really was this resurgence, um, but it was updated to the 90s as opposed to being updated or starting like it was in the 60s. But there was this return to sort of this kind of innocent form, Matt. Because a lot of the bands that did come out of the 90s were, again, largely based within love songs. Primarily, their demographics included teenagers, in particular, teenage girls. Um, but at the same time, even though they had this very clean cut kind of approach to them, and they had this kind of, again, this cheesy, happy-go-lucky, fun attitude. Um, they still had this incorporation of maybe edge at some points, and again, their music was largely based more within pop than trying to incorporate, rock and roll or anything like that. So um, it became largely more of a marketing uh, campaign, pretty much, boy bands during the 90s because they were everywhere and people were taking even sides at one point, I think, as to who was the better band. And to be honest, I really don't care. But I find it so fascinating how the 90s basically took what the 60s did and kind of reincorporated into the 90s because you did see, the haircuts that boys would have within the 90s represented within these boy bands. You would see the kind of love that's maybe a little bit more um, updated, and you could argue that their songs are a lot more generic than the ones that came out rather in the 60s. Um, and there was a lot more emphasis, I think, on music videos, since we, never really were able to fully craft music videos well up until the point of the 80s where we did get MTV that basically created a channel dedicated to music videos. Um, so the 90s boy bands really took advantage of this, and I think a lot of people remember them for their music videos. And I think this is largely a part of how they were able to showcase sort of their brand and who they really were as sort of people, but kind of put them in this sort of cookie cutter way that is sort of a representation of the time period rather than, really actual people. But at the same time, it did capture the culture, it did capture the feelings at the time, and it it embraced the pop to its max, and all the bands made a significant amount of money, and then after the 90s came and went, everybody forgot about them pretty much. Um, Except for Justin Timberlake, who is solo and apparently the only one that's really in the spotlight when you look at all these bands. But again, this was where instead of becoming timeless, they kind of became dated. Unlike in the 60s, where a lot of the bands still sort of have this timeless feel to them, the 90s boy bands kind of just came and went. And after they went, nobody talked really about them again. So yeah, but I find it so interesting that there were so many. and that there was this huge craze for them. But again, they didn't live up to the standards of what the 60s material ultimately gave. So, except I'll say Savage Gardens is pretty good. I mean, I still consider their songs to be decent on the fact that they tried to give a non-generic feel to their songs, especially with their lyrics, as opposed to a lot of Backstreet Boy songs or NSYNC songs. I mean, they're still fun to listen to once in a while, but as far as you remembering the names and, remembering a lot of the songs, probably not, because again, they didn't create that timeless feel that the 60s gave. When it comes to boy bands. So yeah, they're the most fascinating. They're most diverse as far as there, but a lot of them just came and went. But as we move on to the 2000s, um, the Jonas Brothers started. I think really the Jonas Brothers was responsible for starting the trend that we see now. The Jonas Brothers uh, I'm pretty sure they're Disney property if I'm not mistaken. Well, they became Disney property when they had a TV show dedicated to them. But um, long story short, the Jonas Brothers kind of started this trend of incorporating that kind of cheesy, generic marketing tactic. But leveling it out to sort of a max, and taking it sort of in that corporate direction. Unlike the 90s bands, you did feel at least that the 90s bands did have some sense of personality, that they, you know, kind of just, they sort of represented the time period, but at the same time, you didn't feel like that they were trying to, I don't know, they didn't feel like that they were trying to be carbon copies of one another. Like, you still felt that each individual within the band had kind of a distinct personality, um, or at least was kind of capturing the sense of the time period when it comes to the 90s, especially within dress and, with language like slang and stuff. But here in the corporate world that was started, I think, largely by the Jonas Brothers, we get a sense of sameness. You could argue, too, that the Beatles sort of had to embrace that to begin with, too, when they were all wearing suits and ties. But they still all had a sense of personality and they all still fit sort of within the band as to what they contribute. Whereas bands like the Jonas Brothers, they're just there to sing, and even then, they don't really dance all too much. And even when they're doing instrumentals, you just feel that it is just some generic uh, material that was, created by a bunch of people who think that they're more creative than they actually are. So yeah, I think this start within the 2000s was largely attributed to the Jonas Brothers' success and their idea of being kind of more generic, being not really a representation of the time period, but just be this, yeah, this very smiley, happy, really ultra, you know, good-looking teeny bopper. Um, Whereas I think all of the other bands before, at least from what I could tell, most of them were at least within their 20s, or even then later teens, early college years. They didn't seem like they were teenagers, but because the whole idea was as teenagers ultimately want to become adults, and so you appeal to teenagers that way. But here it's more like high school kids appealing to middle schoolers. which is what I think the Jonas Brothers did bring to the table. It brought this whole trend of um, of embracing a younger demographic while at the same time making boys almost, I think, a little bit more feminine. Because when you look at the Jonas Brothers and how they look, you don't really feel like there's a ruggedness to them or that they seem gentlemanly. They just seem like they seem like teenage boys where they don't have that man quality to them. But again, and this is why we see Justin Bieber, who eventually became so popular. Um, it really was this trend into trying to make boys younger instead of older, and in doing so, appealing to a younger women demographic, or not even women, girl demographic, really. So that's really what I think revolutionized boy bands was this idea of why don't we go for a even younger demographic here, and why not we make the boys younger and more, as a result, maybe a little bit more feminine looking. They're not men yet, so we need to find boys. So that's what the Jonas Brothers was. They were the first to sort of start this trend, I believe. Um, so that's something that's very important to note. And as we stroll into the 2010s, we sort of see the same thing with other bands. For example, One Direction being probably the biggest one. Again, they're fairly young boys. They do not look like men yet. They don't look like men yet. They still look like boys. And that's the idea, is that they look like boys, so you can market to younger girls, and hence probably a lot more impressionable girls, because probably middle schoolers are a little bit more impressionable than, let's say, your average high school girl who maybe um, increased her IQ by a couple of points or something. um, so again, what I'm saying is that these kinds of bands usually leave themselves open to impressionable audiences. Um, and as a result, I think this is why we see the genericness sort of continuing with the boy band um, label. Um, Followed by One Direction, we got bands like Big Time Rush and The Wanted, I think, being another one. But yeah, that's really the trend. It has gone from being this very kind of revolutionary um, way of thinking about music, and has gone to pretty much going for the same demographics and kind of going for the same look, appealing to younger and younger, not appealing to older folk. And I think largely that has to do with the fact that with technology, children are a lot easily susceptible to the media, and are capable of seeing things that people around their age in the 60s wouldn't be able to see. And I think largely that has to do with television and technology and whatnot. And, this is where we get these huge fan bases. And it's all based within younger girls. Not so much on the older generation anymore, and not a huge focus on the older generation. As opposed to bands like the Beatles and Jackson 5, who, even though they did appeal to um, girls, uh, they did manage to grasp larger demographics. Whereas now, One Direction pretty much only appeals to a younger female audience, primarily. Sure, there's other demographics in there that you can insert, but largest one being teenage girls. So, and being young teenage girls, and sometimes in some cases impressionable teenage girls. So yeah, and as a result, we've seen boys being represented in a more feminine, um, underdeveloped masculine way. I mean, I'm not saying that these boys are girls, but at the same time, they're very clean. They're I mean, they don't really showcase it doesn't seem like, a lot of their voices have dropped yet. So yeah, there is this appeal to try to market boys rather than men to younger girls, and I think that works, and I think that's why there is a lot younger crowds getting invested in these kinds of bands, because they sort of appeal to their decade. Again, they do have sort of the similar style thing that did start in the 60s. So they are appealing to the times, but I think at the same time, they're also lowering that age level to try to get more younger audiences invested in these kinds of bands. And in doing so, appeal to a more uh, appeal to a demographic that is maybe a little bit more impressionable, um, a little bit more fully developed as far as opinion is concerned. So yeah, it's interesting to see how it's changed over the years. Um, Again, I'm sure One Direction appeals to high schoolers, but I think the preteens are becoming a huge market for these bands. Um, but yeah, that's pretty much sort of the evolution and the way boy bands developed over the years. Not only are they all boys, usually, and most of the songs are either love related or fairly cutesy in nature, um, but a lot of the boy bands do have members that are in large part good looking. Um, they're usually fairly positive unless they have maybe a heartbreak song and then everyone feels sorry for them. But usually they maintain a positive vibe. Um, and again, there's this whole sense of trying to be hip, trying to be, um, cool, and that's what boy bands sort of have done over the years, is that they've tried to be cool for the sake of gaining loyalty and gaining fandom. And that's been all the way back to the 60s. It's been all the way back to the Beatles. They did go out and wear the suits and ties, even though some of them probably didn't want to, because they knew they had to in order to get an audience. So that's really what it comes down to. Boy bands have been largely an influence based upon audience, based upon the people's interests. It's not so much about the art of music itself as much as it is to the appeal of art and of music. And that's what really boy bands gave people. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this topic. I thought it would be an interesting thing to discuss since we are in the month of love, and since some people sort of hold boy bands dear to their hearts, even though I don't really hold them as true, maybe as some other people do. But I do think that they have a huge influence when it comes to our when it comes to the cultural sort of development of music over the years. But yeah, I think that's really ultimately all I can say about this topic. But if there are any questions, comments, concerns, be more than happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a pleasant day, week, month, and year. And I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.